Okay, so today I want to discuss oxidation reactions, specifically those of alcohol substrates, and how these reactions can be fundamentally important for synthetic transformations involving alcohols and carbonyl compounds. So, generally, in organic chemistry, you can think of oxidation reaction with respect to carbon as a reaction that decreases the electron density at carbon. And these oxidation processes are best understood by first assigning an oxidation state. And we're not necessarily going to do very formal oxidation states where we take into account how many hydrogens are necessarily bound, like you might do in a general or analytical course. We're going to think about just the number of electronegative or large heteroatoms that are bound to a carbon. So the oxidation state you can think of as being the number of bonds to a large and or electronegative heteroatom. And some examples of these heteroatoms include nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and chlorine, among others.